Masayuki was supposed to be the safest lie in the Empire, a hero everyone could cheer for, and no one had to understand. Then Velgrynd stepped onto the stage, named herself before the crowd, and turned his coronation into proof no noble could argue with. Fire answered like a sacred mountain waking up. By the time the people started chanting his name, even Testarossa had to pretend this was going according to plan. AI Anime and Manga presents. If you're enjoying the story, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the next episode reach the right fans. YouTube members also get early access while helping cover AI narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and renders. Now, let's return to Caligulio, and the moment he realizes how much of the Empire survived by accident. Caligulio's confession began without excuses. My name is Caligulio. I used to command the Armored Division, the strongest force in the Eastern Empire, and for most of that time I was little more than a fool. I used to tell myself that everything I did was for His Majesty. Looking back, my eyes were fixed on my own fame. A man from low nobility reaching command of an entire division before 40 was something worth boasting about. Compared to that, receiving a barony through marriage felt like scraps. It would be foolish to use that as an excuse, but I cannot deny that I became arrogant. And I regret all of it. Caligulio had begun his career by being chased out by his in-laws. He had been born into a knight captain's family, selected to marry the daughter of a baron from the main house. For a while, he had been happy. The woman he married seemed irreplaceable to him. He thought she was the most beautiful woman in the empire, and he thought he was the happiest man alive. Then his father-in-law died and everything collapsed. The memory still visited him in nightmares, his wife standing before him, coldly telling him that he had enjoyed a pleasant dream, that a poor knight had gotten to play at nobility, and that now her father's order no longer bound her. She blamed him for failing to give her children. Caligulio had wanted to scream. At the time, he believed the bottle she pushed toward him explained everything. He believed she had been drugging him all along. He could have tried to file a complaint, perhaps, but he was up against a baron in his household. His wife already had a wealthy merchant lover, and that merchant had paid off the servants to speak against him. His father-in-law had once lectured him that a noble must remain proud even while living austerely, but that lesson meant nothing now. The merchant gained the noble title, his former wife gained a life of luxury, and Caligulio was thrown out with nothing but humiliation. Back then, he never thought of asking the main family for help, even though they had been the ones to arrange the marriage. His parents had died in an accident when he was young, and no one stood up for him, so he turned the betrayal into fuel. The anger he felt toward the woman he loved pushed him forward. He wanted rank, he wanted power, he wanted revenge. He was still in his early 20s, and he worked himself to the bone on hatred alone. He brushed against death more than once. He took dirty work without flinching, proved useful in undercover operations, cut favorable deals for merchants, and used money to build noble connections. He had graduated from the Knight Academy, so he began as a warrant officer, then climbed rank every year or two. By his mid-20s, his hustle had made him a field officer. In the Empire, where power meant everything, that speed mattered. That was when he met Minitz. Minitz came from nobility, but he loved battle. Whenever he returned home, he was already eager to head back to the front. Caligulio found him baffling but useful. He did not ask Minitz to like or respect him. He asked for money, influence, and work, and Minitz carried out the orders almost cheerfully. Of course, Minitz was using Caligulio too, using that connection to stay near the fighting. In that sense, they were even. Caligulio had no family to leave behind if he died, which let him act as recklessly as he wanted. And Minitz was exactly the kind of man who would follow those reckless orders. Somehow, ambition and appetite made them a good match. Then Kanzis entered the picture. Kanzis was notorious for being difficult, disobedient, and violent. But to Caligulio, usefulness mattered more than reputation. Kanzis had overwhelming strength, and if he could be aimed at the right operation, he was a gift. So Caligulio used both men as hard as he could. He designed missions that ordinary commanders would hesitate to touch, sent Minitz and Kanzis into them, and kept winning until no one in the army could complain anymore. By his early 30s, Caligulio had reached the upper officer ranks. He no longer spent much time on the front lines, partly because an earlier poisoning had cost him the sight in his left eye. But the Empire had opened itself to science, and science gave him an elaborate artificial eye. He usually hid it beneath an eye patch anyway. If an enemy underestimated him, all the better. Internally, he felt stronger than ever. His body had been enhanced, his stamina stayed at its peak, and fear seemed far away. He enjoyed ranking duels, but domination of the military mattered more. He sensed a commander's rank within reach, a rank that could give him influence surpassing even the Imperial knights who served His Majesty directly. So he continued building his faction. He used Ghidorah to strengthen the armored division and relied on merchants to modernize it. By just past his mid-30s, the preparations, the influence, and the resume all lined up, and Caligulio was named one of the Empire's 3 generals of the Guardians. Life could not have been going better. That was why in quiet moments between duties, he wondered what had happened to the Baron's family that had driven him out. When he investigated, he found the answer had arrived before he ever moved a hand. His story was famous in the military, and soldiers under his command had pressured business contacts on his behalf. No one wanted to keep dealing with people who had disgraced their commander. The merchant who had taken Caligulio's place had wanted nobility because imperial commerce was tied to noble and military privilege. A title meant legal access to business, but he had never expected the man he laughed out of the house to become a general. The military budget created enormous commercial opportunities, and high officers decided who benefited from them. A mere baron could not compete with a general of the Guardians. His military business quietly dried up. That should have satisfied Caligulio, but it only left him hollow. He had wanted revenge with his own hands, yet revenge had happened without him. And still he would not let go. If he softened, he told himself, others would take advantage of him. Part of his rise had been possible because he had no children and would not found a lasting noble line. High-ranking officers could receive titles on retirement, but nobles feared military men who became too wealthy, and the military feared nobles with private armies. A single, childless officer was less threatening to that balance. Caligulio understood that and used it. He began to imagine stripping the barony itself from the people who betrayed him. Then he thought of the merchant's father, the earl behind him, and every person who had made his humiliation possible. To crush an earl, he needed even greater power. So his ambition sharpened again, and Caligulio aimed for a force that could beat anyone on the planet. That was the story he had been telling Minitz in the Elf Club. Caligulio admitted that after all that, he had been trapped in his own little world. He knew, somewhere, how dirty his actions were, but he had stopped seeing it. Minitz answered with dry honesty. Caligulio had not exactly been a pretty sight. Caligulio told him that Minitz would have been justified abandoning him. If he had, Minitz might have become general instead. Minitz brushed that away. He had never wanted that kind of job, and he had never hated Caligulio. Kanzis had been the same. Good or bad, Minitz preferred to deal with people he liked. Caligulio laughed at that. Minitz knew he was odd and did not need to be reminded. The 2 men shared the laugh. Caligulio, a skinny officer in his 40s, and Minitz, newly dressed in a tailored suit. They were sitting in the Elf Club, an exclusive members-only venue inside the labyrinth, drinking and reminiscing after the Tempest and Empire Summit. Normally, they would never have set foot inside. You needed a place on the list, body checks and an entrance fee. But Rimuru had opened it to high-ranking Imperial officers as a gesture toward putting the war behind them and building a better relationship. Caligulio and Minitz understood the meaning of the invitation, and they accepted it. Caligulio summed up the rest of his history with brutal simplicity. He had taken control of the army, dreamed of conquering the world, and then this nation had beaten them. Minitz corrected him. Beaten made it sound like a schoolyard brawl. In truth, the Empire had not even put up a fight. Caligulio let out a rueful laugh. No doubt. Minitz, however, was glad he had seen it. He had learned with his own eyes that Emperor Ludora and the Marshal Lady Velgrynd were not the most unimaginable powers in the world. Caligulio did not understand why that made him happy. But if Minitz was glad, then so be it. He asked whether Minitz intended to make up with his brother. Minitz gave him a self-deprecating smile. He pretty much had to. His younger brother was the Marquis gathering the nobility together, and with Sir Masayuki set up as the new emperor, supporting him had become their job. Minitz had been born into a Marquis family, but he joined the army to prove himself. Preferential treatment helped him rise, but his talent was real. Nobody with sense dismissed him, and anyone who did usually learned very quickly how foolish that was. It was his younger brother who inherited the title, and that brother resented him for leaving the responsibility behind. Caligulio had only recently learned this, so hearing that Minitz wanted to mend fences relieved him. Caligulio thought of how different their lives were. A peaceful agreement had never been possible for him. Minitz at least had a family fortune, freedom, and enough strength to make his extravagance look like a style instead of disgrace. Caligulio doubted the brothers truly hated each other. Anyone forced into that position would complain. It simply took someone like Minitz to abandon a noble title and get away with it. So Caligulio told him he would be counting on his support, Mr. Prime Minister. Minitz had escaped noble duties only to be dragged into something worse. Under Masayuki's new administration, he had been appointed Prime Minister, one of the highest offices in the Empire. That promotion had begun as one of Masayuki's desperate conversations with Rimuru. Masayuki had protested that he could not possibly be emperor. He had never studied politics, except the bits he skimmed in high school for tests. Rimuru laughed and refused to let him flake out. If Rimuru could muddle through as a ruler, Masayuki could grow into the role too. Masayuki knew exactly how optimistic that sounded. He accused Rimuru of wearing the biggest not my problem look imaginable and of being pleased to have another friendly monarch to schmooze with. Rimuru denied it badly and pointed out that Masayuki had people he could lean on. Minitz, for example, looked reliable. That eye contact was Minitz's mistake. Whether Rimuru had acted on a whim or not, Minitz had stood out in the conference. Once Rimuru labeled him capable, he became Masayuki's advisor. Once the dust settled, advisor became Prime Minister. Great, Minitz could only think. Masayuki personally asked for help, and Minitz could not refuse. Besides, he actually liked Masayuki. It was better than being crushed beneath Velgryn's gaze all day. There was one obvious problem. The Empire already had a Prime Minister. Minitz decided the current one could become his assistant. The Emperor had the exclusive right to name his cabinet, and any complaint belonged with Masayuki, not with him. If the old minister still wanted to make trouble, Minitz had met far scarier people by now and could point him in their direction. Compared with Velgrynd, Testarossa, and the people around Rimuru, a disgruntled official was not much of a threat. With that thought, he decided it would work out in time. He had been educated as a Marquis heir, and despite his own casual attitude, he was capable. So he returned Caligulio's jab and called him Mr. Secretary of the Military, reminding him that he was the only surviving division commander left and had plenty of work ahead. Under Emperor Masayuki, the Empire's military would undergo massive reform. With Minitz as Prime Minister, the old Prime Minister would become Deputy Prime Minister. Secretary of the Military stood at the same level. Masayuki knew little about government, but he remembered that civilian authority should oversee military affairs. What he actually said was something like, "Don't we need a minister controlling the army?" The result was imperfect. The Secretary of the Military was still chosen from the army's commanders, leaving Caligulio as both secretary and army commander. That concern sat behind Minitz's remark, but Caligulio laughed it off. There would be no war for a while, he said, and as long as he controlled the army, he would not rattle his saber at any foreign country. He meant it. The Empire no longer had easy enemies. Jura Tempest and Milim's domain were impossible targets. War with Dwargan was unthinkable while the dwarves were helping them. An airship invasion of the western nations might be physically possible, but Rimuru would never allow it. There was no outside state left for the army to point its spears toward without creating a disaster. The only enemies left were inside their own borders. Powerful nobles with regional military power, the kind who might mistake the new era for a chance at rebellion. Minitz said they had already sent word across the Empire. Noble replies would arrive soon. As for Krishna, he had made no dangerous move yet. The factions tied to Minitz's brother had sworn loyalty to the new emperor, which kept the other factions in check for the moment. Caligulio was not satisfied. Even loyal replies would not silence the sons of the Emperor before Ludora, or the families related to him by blood. Minitz agreed. They had announced that Emperor Ludora had passed away, so some people would naturally assume their own turn was approaching. That fantasy would require Lady Velgrynd's consent, of course, but fools rarely thought that far. They might claim the Imperial household law no longer had teeth. They might say it could be ignored. They would not realize how angry that would make Velgrynd. Caligulio did not fear rebellious nobles. Between Minitz and himself, victory was nearly guaranteed. The danger was what civil conflict would do to the nation's strength. The being who had replaced Ludora, though Caligulio struggled to frame it that way after serving him for so long, had cooperated with the unknown invaders called the aggressors and nearly thrown the world into chaos. They had fought one of their leaders, Cornu. Velgrynd had saved the Empire then, but without her, the entire nation might have fallen. The thing wearing Ludora's place had wanted power close to a god's, and there was no dismissing the possibility that he would use the Empire's people as pawns. Very few citizens knew Ludora's face, so a false emperor could be rejected if necessary. But the Ludora Caligulio remembered had never been the sort to begin by opening diplomatic talks. That left one conclusion: now was no time for the nation to fight itself. Minitz promised to put out feelers. Caligulio, meanwhile, wanted to gather the remaining Imperial Knights and reorganize the Imperial Guardians at once. That became his first major task as Secretary of the Military, and it was harder than he had expected. He did not even know exactly how many had survived, or what missions the Imperial Knights had been assigned to. Locations were scattered, contact had to come first. Some would want to leave the force too. Krishna was one of them. He practically worshipped Rimuru as a god and had already declared that he intended to quit and live in Tempest. Caligulio asked him to remain until the Empire calmed down. But Krishna looked ready to defy that order the moment he could. Then Adelman stepped in with advice. It was important to clean up your own messes, he told Krishna. Leaving while the Empire remained in chaos would surely sadden Sir Rimuru. That convinced Krishna completely. He shouted that the argument was extremely persuasive and that, while his only thought had been that he was saved, he now needed to bring Sir Rimuru's mercy to the ears of innocent Imperial citizens. Caligulio could not follow the logic exactly, but the practical result was enough. Krishna was back at his post. It was not the reaction Caligulio expected, but Krishna returned to duty and worked hard. Caligulio decided not to dwell on the details. Krishna was not alone. A large share of Imperial soldiers were voicing a desire to stay in Tempest. Caligulio understood them and did not want to force anyone back, but too many defections would weaken the Empire's future ability to fight. They had to think carefully. Many had died in the war. The Empire had brought that on itself, more or less, but the aftermath could not be ignored. Only 2 single digits remained alive: Bernie and Jiwoo. From now on, they would answer directly to Masayuki as bodyguards. Velgrynd would have been enough protection by herself, perhaps. But Bernie and Jiwoo could also advise him and handle smaller missions, so Masayuki's request was approved. Caligulio took the chance to rethink the Imperial Guardians themselves. The old system did not need to cling to exactly 100 members. He intended to abolish ranking duels entirely. Numbers should not matter so much among soldiers. If they were strong enough and absolutely loyal to the Emperor, he was willing to widen the doors. His new plan would deploy guardians in groups of 3 across Imperial cities, strengthening defense where people actually lived. 3 warriors might not defeat a high-level aggressor, but they could buy time. Ideally, they would stay mobile, support one another, and call in backup. The Empire had more than 100 cities, so personnel would be tight, but the regional forces were intact enough for the Guardians to work alongside them until the system matured. Either way, the Guardians would survive as a combat force built around Enlightened-class warriors. Minitz finished his drink and muttered that both of them faced an uphill battle. Caligulio agreed, but it felt oddly worthwhile. Bettering the Empire, instead of merely chasing rank, made the work feel fulfilling. And after hearing Lord Rimuru's plans, they needed to stabilize the government immediately. If they moved too slowly, the Empire would be left behind by the world. With Rimuru and Masayuki's approval, rail work had already begun. In a few years, the empire could be connected to the growing rail network. That alone made Caligulio tremble, but it was only the beginning. Rimuru had also spoken, while everyone was drinking, about ruling the world's skies. Caligulio had learned that Rimuru could not physically get drunk, so the casual tone did not mean the words were empty. Zamdo was thrilled. He was more engineer than soldier, and he had offered his help immediately. Magitrains would link surface nations, airships would be mass-produced, and a market could be built around them. It was frightening that Rimuru could even imagine a plan like that. But it was not impossible. After all, the only reparations Rimuru had demanded were rights to Imperial airspace. He had asked for nothing else, and he was helping the Empire rebuild. How could they turn him down? Masayuki had approved the plan too, so the future mattered more than the pride they had lost. Caligulio noticed something strange about Tempest. Rimuru would say things that sounded improvised, only for someone to turn those words into executable plans by the next day, or even that same evening. Rimuru had apparently considered airship mass production as soon as he learned the Empire had them. Now an entire floor of the dungeon was being used as a hangar for airship repairs and upgrades. Zamdo was having the time of his life there, free to order whatever materials he wanted without worrying about budget. He had started saying that heaven existed right here after all. Caligulio felt a twinge of jealousy seeing every one of Zamdo's desires fulfilled, but he still cheered him on. If Tempest and the Empire wanted friendly ties to last, Zamdo had to work hard. The larger issue was the future. Rimuru's proposal offered broad support for improving Imperial infrastructure. After such a devastating defeat, the Empire could not refuse. It could provide its own labor at least, and Caligulio was clear-headed enough to see the opportunity. What the Empire needed most was domestic order. The country was not in complete disarray yet, but once the details of the defeat spread, the shock would be severe. Anyone who had lost family in the war would likely see Rimuru as a hated enemy. Krishna and other officers were working to prevent that hatred from growing, but Caligulio needed to face it too. Minitz also warned that powerful nobles were making ominous moves. The Empire would have to welcome Tempestian forces for future development, but if that invitation sparked disputes, everything could fall apart. There was a mountain of problems before them. Minitz then pointed out something else. Rimuru might have it much worse than they did. Caligulio considered it and realized Minitz was right. They were just beginning to turn future plans into work. Restoring order and developing one's homeland were not things done only because someone ordered them. You kept at them day after day because you wanted home to become better. The aggressors were still out there, and an unavoidable battle would come eventually, but for the moment the work itself buried fear. That might have been part of Rimuru's design. Caligulio wondered aloud if Rimuru was trying to keep them from worrying. Minitz thought so, though perhaps it was more than that. Rimuru might intend for Tempest to handle the aggressors alone, or he might not see them as a major problem at all. Of course the aggressors were a problem, but Rimuru seemed more focused on his grand future plans than on that fear. Maybe it was a bluff, maybe it was confidence. Either way, Caligulio reached a new conclusion. If Rimuru was seriously thinking of dealing with the aggressors alone, the Empire had to find a way to help him. At the very least, they had to prevent internal revolt from dragging him down. Caligulio was ready to serve his leader. After about an hour of drinking, he and Minitz left the Elf Club. The next day, they placed Masayuki on his palanquin and set off for the Imperial capital. The moment Caligulio reached the capital, work swallowed him whole. Some areas of the city had been damaged during the war, but rebuilding could wait until Rimuru and the Tempestians were ready. The first priority was military reorganization. All surviving or resurrected soldiers and officers were safely back in the Empire, and Caligulio quickly assigned them new duties. Maintaining order mattered most. The capital was tense, grief was spreading, and even a rumor could turn into violence if ignored, so he watched Krishna's reports and dispatched soldiers to any region showing unrest. Fortunately, roughly 700,000 soldiers and officers still remained loyal to him. Even the ones who wanted to move to Tempest cooperated for now. Rimuru had promised them jobs after the turmoil subsided, but he did not pressure them. In the Colosseum, he had told them not to decide immediately. They should take their time and think it over. Velgrynd then presented a detailed immigration plan. Rimuru was respecting individual desires, not recruiting by force. Even so, the 200,000 potential immigrants in the audience were enthusiastic. Some shouted that if the aggressors came, they would rip them apart. They were ready for a fight. They had lost the power in their souls, but their surgically enhanced bodies remained. Some still deserved a rank, and that was no small thing. So Caligulio searched for every way to keep the capital peaceful. Then the bigger problem appeared exactly where he expected it: the nobility. Nobles from every level demanded audiences with him, slowing his work. He wanted to reject all of them, but some were too influential to ignore. Some had troops, some had money, and some had old names that still mattered to frightened citizens. Minitz's overtures and Krishna's military pressure prevented any major crisis, but the effort drained Caligulio's stamina. Then Rimuru sent him a lifesaver, Testarossa, that most beautiful of demons. Testarossa's first task was a public speech meant to win over the masses. She would soothe the frayed nerves of a shocked, defeated populace while completely ignoring the nobles. Caligulio worried that this was no work for a demon, a race practically born to strike fear into hearts. Surprisingly, he was wrong. Demons lived on emotions. If someone needed to cleanly remove terror and anxiety from an entire crowd, demons were uniquely qualified. The danger was not whether she could do it. The danger was how much she would take. Caligulio admitted his surprise to Testarossa. Lady Testarossa, once Blanc, had brought so much pain and strife to the Empire, yet she now clearly cared for its people. Testarossa's answer was simple. Why would she not? That was the job assigned to her by Sir Rimuru, her overlord. Caligulio tried to correct himself. Naturally, yes, but he had expected a rougher approach. Or rather, he had not expected such a reserved, moderate one. He chose his words carefully and sweated through the attempt. Testarossa did not mind. They could not afford for Sir Rimuru to gain a bad reputation here, she explained. Of course she would be careful in how she carried herself. But restraint thinned the effect too, and striking the right balance was difficult. If a demon consumed all of someone's emotions, it usually left bad effects behind. Caligulio winced. He certainly did not want that. Testarossa would never make such a beginner's mistake, though. She had ordered Moss to keep close track of her subordinates, so success was practically guaranteed. The elegance of it unnerved him more than open cruelty would have. Still, her point was real. A moderate approach made it harder to fully control a crowd's emotions. The citizens had lost relatives, lost a war, and gained a new emperor all at once. Their sadness had not vanished. Anxiety and dissent remained as small buds. Caligulio placed peacekeeping forces at key points around the city so riots and conflict could be stopped before they began. Testarossa observed that if anyone defied them, it would be cleaner and easier to kill the entire clan. Caligulio forced out a laugh and called it funny. He knew she was not joking. That made him respect Rimuru all the more for sending her. Blanc always meant business. In time, the citizens began to calm down. No one was foolish enough to attempt armed rebellion. Caligulio was relieved to see progress, but Testarossa already had another idea. The quickest way to give the people mental care, she decided, was to introduce the new Emperor Masayuki to them. In other words, they would stage a coronation. If Masayuki gave a speech as well, the citizens could accept it as the legitimate dawn of a new era. Masayuki nearly squeaked. Me? Testarossa asked whether that was a problem. Masayuki, with tears in his eyes, decided there was no problem at all. Testarossa's smile left him no other answer. Then Velgrynd entered, asking what Testarossa was doing to make Masayuki cry like that. Testarossa replied calmly that this was a regrettable way to put it. She was not into that sort of play at all. The two beauties exchanged smiles. Their gazes collided and filled the room with terrifying pressure. Masayuki and Caligulio took the brunt of it. Masayuki held on while silently praying he could leave soon. Caligulio attempted an impromptu meditation to calm his heart. Their wishes did not matter. The coronation was now settled. Countless citizens packed the main square before the Imperial Palace. Masayuki stood above them on a balcony high in the building, looking down at the crowd. He had arrived by Velgrynd's teleportation, making this essentially his first public appearance in the Empire. He was dressed like an emperor, and if he kept his mouth shut, one could almost detect dignity around him by squinting hard enough. At the appointed time, Caligulio opened the ceremony with a few words. Then Minitz, as Prime Minister, summarized recent events. The Empire had suffered a major defeat. The previous Emperor Ludora had passed away. The new Emperor Masayuki the hero had already been crowned. Through his actions, peace had been reached with Tempest. Friendly relations would be built going forward, and official ties with the Dwarven Kingdom had opened as well. There was a reason to frame Ludora this way? To prevent another disaster like Michael's castle guard skill. The people needed to accept that Ludora had been the root of the Empire's problems. Calling him dead and reducing the number of those loyal to him would help. The explanation was politically useful, even if the truth underneath was far stranger than most citizens could understand. But many citizens still struggled to accept Masayuki, a man not related by blood, taking the throne. Velgrynd stepped forward to answer them. She told the silly fools to quiet down. Her name was Velgrynd. Velgrynd the Cardinal. The name of the Empire's guardian dragon froze the crowd. Could it be? They all wondered the same thing. The guardian dragon was not a court rumor or a distant legend to these people. She was the authority that made the Imperial household law feel sacred. By the laws of the Imperial household, Velgrynd declared Masayuki the hero, the new emperor. As she spoke, she released her overwhelming dominance. An almost visible wave rolled over the audience, the famed cardinal aura, divine enough for anyone to recognize. Then, as if it were an afterthought, she gestured toward the distance and told the people to behold the salute for their new emperor. The Divine Aerie of Fire began to spew lava. The volcanic eruption was visible from the heart of the capital, far too gigantic to be called a simple salute. To Velgrynd, it might have been like playing with matches. To ordinary citizens, it was enough to leave them speechless. No one could doubt it. The erupting mountain was divine and sacred. Engineering such a display without the flame dragon's permission would invite wrath too terrible to imagine. No citizen of the capital would even think to try. Then molten lava shot from the crater toward the city, only to be deflected by an invisible protective wall. It could only be the guardian dragon's power. The crowd began to whisper, then shout. Their dragon god had manifested before their very eyes. Excitement swelled through the square. As the shock settled into understanding, the citizens realized what Velgrynd's approval meant. Masayuki the hero truly was their emperor. Masayuki's fame helped finish the work. His popularity was centered in the Western nations, but the Empire knew his name too. Voices rose from the crowd. Was that really Lightspeed Masayuki? Was he the strongest hero the world had ever seen? No wonder the Demon Lord Rimuru could not say no to him. Praise rained down as if talented actors were reading from the same script. That was Masayuki's power. He was famous everywhere, and now his unique skill had grown stronger, reaching farther and affecting everyone who knew him. In a normal ruler, that would have been absurd luck. In Masayuki, it became a working political solution. The result was the kind of cheering he had grown used to. Then the crowd took up a single chant. Masayuki, Masayuki. That chant rose in perfect harmony, like the voice of every Imperial subject becoming one. Velgrynd privately thought that it should be Emperor Masayuki, but Masayuki himself did not seem bothered, so she let it pass. The truly furious one was Testarossa. The citizens had arrived at the completely wrong idea, that Rimuru would not dare cross Masayuki. The thought enraged her to the core, but she was the one who had inadvertently led them there. She could not complain to anyone present, so she only smiled and endured it. And just like that, Masayuki had the people on his side. It went far easier than anyone expected. Thanks to that, the name of the divinely ordained emperor of the Nazca Namrium Ulmeria United Eastern Empire became known to the entire world.
Route confirmed. The next episode and full playlist are ready.
Then don't stop here. Keep watching in story order and subscribe before the next part drops.